Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on long and short stitch shading. I know a lot of you would like to learn how to do needle painting, but don't know where to start. I can recall my own first frustrated attempts to learn the technique and know how helpful it would have been to see live demonstrations of the stitch. I want you to feel as though we are in a workshop together. We will start at the very beginning, and I will walk you through each step. You will be able to stitch along with a DVD or play back each section as often as you need on your computer or television. You will see that the main menu gives you the option of playing all or playing individual subsections. The outlines for these tutorials can be found on the second disc, which also includes some projects for you to print out and stitch. The advantage of a DVD is that the camera allows us to zoom in on the finer points that could not normally be seen in a classroom environment. This workshop is ideal for beginners, but can also be used by embroiderers who have some previous experience and want to fine-tune their technique. I hope that this helps you to gain confidence in the technique, but most importantly, I want you to love long and short stitch shading as much as I do and take pleasure in your stitching. Let me explain a bit about long and short stitch. It is a surface embroidery technique used to fill a motif with subtle shading. The shading is worked in rows of stitching which softly blend into each other. It is often referred to as silk shading, soft shading, thread painting or needle painting, and can be done in cotton, silk or wool. Long and short stitch shading can be used for decorative embroidery such as Jacobean, stump work or gold work, or to reproduce a picture. I use long and short stitch shading for needle painting. I don't aim to reproduce an exact replica of the original, but rather my own version of what I see in the picture. Here are some examples of my work. This was one of my earlier projects, the poppy, from my book Redoute's Finest Flowers in Embroidery. Back then, I used padding to get a 3D look, but then I discovered I could use contrast in shades to get the same effect. Here is the magnolia from my second book, Long and Short Stitch Embroidery, a collection of flowers. It was reproduced from Paul Jones's painting with the permission of Shirley Sherwood from her book on botanical art. It is important that you gain permission from the artist or copyright holder before using any paintings or photos. This is the white poppy with blueberries from my third book, Crewel and Surface Embroidery. I used a mix of cotton, wool and silk in these projects. These are some of my personal creations not found in books or kits. A king protea from Shirley Sherwood's book on botanical paintings. A picture of some bee-eaters, and a malachite kingfisher which are reproduced from professional wildlife photos. Here we have Elise, a portrait of a Lebanese girl reproduced from a painting. Finally, an iris Spartan which I have just completed and is now available as a kit on my website. Let me show you around my workspace. This is my studio in Somerset West near Cape Town in South Africa. It is upstairs with large windows that look out over a beautiful view of the surrounding mountains. I consider myself very fortunate to work in such a lovely environment, but I have not always been here. At one time, this was my husband's office, and I had a walk-in cupboard with no windows. Here you can see the photos of my three daughters, Stacy and Tess, who have now left home, and Katie, who is 8 years old. My computer setup where I do all my designing, books and kits. You may be interested to see where I keep all my threads, fabric and supplies. I have numerous brands of thread and try to keep them all organized, but they don't always look this neat. I spent a lot of time tidying up for your benefit. These are DMC threads. Each drawer corresponds to the color chart, so I can just pull out a drawer to find a shade when I need it. and these are Eterna Chinese silks, which I use for very fine details. The ultimate fabric to use for needle painting is of course linen, a good quality Irish or Belgian linen, also known as church linen, with a very close weave. The advantage of linen over cotton is that the fibres spring back into place when a hole is formed with a needle. It can be on the expensive side, but it's definitely worth the investment. And look how beautifully packaged it is. To make sure you are working with the grain of the fabric and not against it, pull a thread along two sides of your fabric at right angles, like this. For these demonstrations, I'm using a medium weight cotton satin fabric, which has a very close weave. This fabric is ideal for beginners, as it is inexpensive and easy to stitch on. If your fabric is mounted onto a frame or hoop across the grain like this, your stitching will pucker when you take it out. Always mount the fabric at right angles. You can overcast the edges of your fabric on a sewing machine to prevent fraying, or you can tape the edges with masking tape, like this. I prefer to use a stretcher frame like this, because it does not leave any hoop marks which are impossible to get rid of. They come in different sizes so that you can assemble the size you need and are incredibly light. All you need to do is stretch the fabric over the frame and secure in place with drawing pins around the edge, like this. However, for small designs, it is probably more convenient to use a hoop. If you must use a hoop, I recommend a Susan Bates Super Grip hoop like this, as it really does keep your fabric drum tight, which is essential for this type of embroidery. To mount your fabric, place the inner hoop with the lip facing up towards you. Center your fabric on top of this, and then place the outer hoop with the number facing you on top of this. Push down until you feel it click into place. The outer hoop will slip under the lip of the inner hoop. Now tighten the screw and adjust the fabric until it is drum tight. Give it the flick test, and it should sound hollow. I will be using DMC stranded cotton, which is available in approximately 450 solid shades of color. It is the ideal thread for this type of embroidery. The cotton comes on skeins like this. You will see a little tail. Pull on this and it comes out. The thread is comprised of 6 easily separated strands. We will be using one strand at a time, except in the first row, where you can sometimes use 2. All thread has a nap, which is the direction that the pile of the yarn lies. To keep your stitching smooth, it helps to thread your needle with a strand in the same direction each time. An easy way to keep track of the direction you thread your yarn into the needle is to pull out a length of thread. I like to use about 60 centimeters at a time. Then separate one strand and pull it out from the rest. Cut it off like this and thread the top end through the needle. Each time you re-thread, pull out another strand and use the same end. I will be using a number 9 crewel needle. It has a long eye, which makes it ideal for threading stranded cotton. Ideally, you should use a smaller number 10 needle for one strand of cotton, but the number 9 can be used for 1 or 2 strands. My choice of colors is based on personal experience through trial and error. To give you an idea, here are a few examples. In long and short stitch shading, you need to have a good contrast of shades from light to dark to give your subject life and dimension. Basically, the paler shades represent light and the dark shades represent shadow. Here is an example. If I have enough space in my shape, I would use about 7 shades from light to dark. A good way to make sure you have enough contrast in your shades is to compare the first shade with the last shade. There should be quite a dramatic difference. Each shade has a slightly deeper tone, so that the shades softly blend into each other with little transition. If it were a smaller shape, I would have to take out some of the shades, like this. But notice that I still have a light, medium, dark, and very dark shade in my combination. If the shades were too close, like this, I would not have any contrast and it would look flat. Another way to reduce shades but still provide contrast is to replace the light shades with a mid-tone that is a slightly brighter tone than the others, like this. Because sunshine adds a yellow tint to color, it could have a yellowish tint. You can see this is slightly green. This shade is more vivid than the others, so provides a good contrast. Here is another example in reds. These can be quite tricky because there is not really a light red. You would have to start going into pinks. But if I replace the first shade of red with more of an orangey tint, see how it enhances it. One of the most interesting combinations is with blue and lavender. If I replace the first shade with lavender, see what happens? It immediately gives life to the blue shades next to it. It is important that you work in a good light for this type of work. Magnification is helpful, but light is essential. I could not do this work without my daylight magnifier. See how it magnifies and lights up the work, making it so much easier to see all the detail. If you can't afford it, invest in a good daylight, something like this, and use a pair of reading glasses placed on top of your specs. These will magnify your work. I have transferred the outline of the shape onto my fabric with a fine micron pen so that it shows up well on the demonstration. You could use a pencil. A fairly dark soft pencil such as 3B works well. To do this, place your outline on a light box or against a window and tape it in place with masking tape. Place your fabric on top of this. Find the center of your fabric and again tape in place. With a light showing through, you will easily be able to see the lines. Trace over these lines. You could also use a good quality carbon paper if your fabric is thick and you can't see the tracing. It is a good idea to iron your outline after tracing to fix it. Shading does not always follow straight lines. If you look at a petal like this iris, for example, you will see that it most often tapers towards the center. To make sure that your stitching follows the direction of your motif, you need to use guidelines. I'm going to draw these in with a black pen for clarity, but you would use a pencil. Draw a line down the center of the motif, then a second line down the center again, and keep adding lines till you feel you have enough. If it is a curved motif, you will draw your lines in a curve, like this. I have found this the best way to secure my thread, as it does not leave any lumps and bumps. Please don't use a knot. If you are starting inside a shape, bring your needle up through the fabric and leave a small tail at the back. Make a tiny stitch. And then a second stitch at right angles to this and back into the first stitch. Pull your thread firmly to make sure it is secure, and then cut the tail off at the back. Make sure that this stitch is in a place that will be covered by stitching. Alongside the edge is normally good. If you are starting on a line, make 2 small running stitches about 10 millimeters away from the starting point. Then go back to the starting point and begin your stitching. The securing stitches will be covered as you work. When ending off, you can either make another small securing stitch, or you can run it under a few stitches at the back. Either is fine. It is a good idea to outline your motif with split stitch before filling it with long and short stitch. This gives your shape a nice firm edge and helps to define the motif, especially if there are lots of different layers. The long and short stitch filling should always go over the outline, like this. You will see how to do this in part 4, but if you are a beginner, you may find it easier to stitch the shape without an outline to start with. Before I start, let me explain a bit about long and short stitch. The name is misleading because it is actually more like irregular satin stitch. In fact, the stitch was originally derived from satin stitch. So I want you to forget about trying to stitch one long stitch, one short stitch, and think staggered satin stitch instead. This will make life a lot easier. Satin stitch is composed of straight stitches worked side by side to fill a shape like this. Long and short stitch is staggered at the base in the first row and staggered up and down in the following rows, like this. I'm going to demonstrate on this small petal motif using 6 shades of teal green from light to very dark. Begin with the first row at the top of the shape. You should always work from the wider part towards the narrow part, as it is easier to reduce stitches than to add on. Start in the center of the shape and work towards the sides. This helps to establish the direction of your stitches. These stitches will be about 1 centimeter in length, some a bit longer. Don't be tempted to shorten your stitches to save space. Keep a good length so that you have plenty of depth for the stitches in the second row. Work random stitches across the row in line with your guidelines, and then go back and fill in the gaps. Notice how I am working slightly down the sides of the shape, as I don't want straight rows. Keep a good firm tension, not so firm that you pucker your fabric, but not so loose that the stitches float on top. Continue on the other side until the first row is complete. Notice that in this first row I have used 2 strands. This can only be done in the first row to make it full. All other rows will be done in 1 strand. If you have a very small motif, it is better to use 1 strand. The stitches in the first row need to be very close together, but not overlapping, so that you have enough stitching to work back into the next row. If you have gaps in this row when you stitch the next row, it'll form holes. Let me show you an enlarged example. Here I have stitched one side of the shape with gaps and the other side full. When I come up into the full side, I can place my stitches wherever I want. But when I come up into the sparse side, holes form like this, which makes your stitching look rough and uneven. We are now going to stitch the second row. Change to the next darker shade of thread and use one strand only, as this will make your shading look fine. For this row, I like to turn my work around so I can see where I am going in the shape, but you can do whatever you're comfortable with. Again, start in the center of the motif and work across. Bring the needle up through the previous stitches and down into the shape. If you want smooth shading, always come up through the stitches and down into the shape. This motion pulls the thread fibers down so that they lie flat. Going down into the stitch has the opposite effect, causing little holes to form like pepper marks. Here is a larger example of this. The one on the right shows the stitches coming up. Notice the smoothness. And the one on the left shows the stitches going down. Notice these little pepper marks here. Back to row 2. Split right back into the previous row and work random stitches across the row in line with your guidelines. Then come back and fill in the gaps. Notice that I'm working some of my stitches right back into the first row, almost at the beginning, and then bringing some forward. This staggers the stitches so that they're not all in a straight line. You want the shading to look natural, not in hard bands of color. Let me show you an enlarged example of this. Notice the hard lines which form bands of color on this one, and how the shading gently blends in this one, with no obvious transition between shades. Continuing with row 2, aim at splitting some yarn when you come up through the stitches, as this anchors the stitches down. This does not mean you have to split each strand of thread. If you do happen to come up between threads, make sure it is in a place where the stitches are full and close together. To help you decide where to place a stitch, trace a line with the tip of your needle, like this. Let me show you again. Trace with the tip of your needle and insert into the shape. Turn your work around and look at it from afar. If a hard line forms, go back and add in a few stitches like this to break it up. A good way to tell if the second row is full enough is to look at the base of the stitches. If there are any gaps, go back and add in a few more stitches. Change to the next darkest shade of thread and work as before for row 2. Work random stitches across the row in line with your guidelines, and then go back and fill in the gaps. As the shape tapers down, you will naturally reduce the stitches in each row to adapt to the shape so that they do not become overcrowded. Don't shorten your stitches because you think you're running out of space. Rather, split right back into each row. The shades from each previous row will peep out, showing just enough color to merge with the next. Continue each row of shading like this until the shape is filled. To summarize, row 1, stitch staggered stitches across the shape using 2 strands of thread. These stitches should be full and close together. Row 2, change to next shade and bring your stitches up through the previous stitches. Remember, up, not down. The stitches should be staggered and not in a straight line. Row 3, continue stitching each subsequent row as for row 2, changing to the next shade of color each time until the shape is completed. Shading does not always follow a straight course, and sometimes you will need to direct your stitches to fit the shape. For your shading to look natural, your stitches need to follow the direction of your motif. For example, if you look at a petal, you will see it most often tapers towards the center. I'm going to show you a very easy way to get around a curve. This method works well for any awkward or complex motifs where you need to guide your stitches around the shape. I am demonstrating on the same petal as before, but with a strong curve. It is essential to draw in guidelines for a curved shape to direct your stitches. Without lines, you won't know where to go. The easiest way to get straight stitches to follow a curve is to shorten the stitches in each row and stitch 2 rows of each shade. Stitches can only be straight, never curved, so if they are short, it is easier to adapt the direction. Use 2 strands of the lightest shade in the first row to get the fullness. After that, change to 1 strand for all the other rows. Start in the center of your shape and work out towards one side. Work across the row as before, placing staggered stitches across the row in line with the direction lines. Again, this row needs to be full and close together. Notice how I am using quite short stitches, about 1/2 centimeter, maybe a bit longer. Now I'm going to rethread my needle with one strand of the same shade of thread and work a second row of short stitches into the first. Can you see the advantage of these short stitches? Each one is moving forward in small increments, changing the angle slightly each time to stay in line with the guidelines. Because it is the same shade, any changes of angle will not be obvious. Continue working across the row, splitting right back into the previous row and keeping in line with your guidelines. Change to the next shade of color. Again, start in the center and work out towards the sides. Once more, work 2 short rows in this shade before moving on to the next shade. In each row, you will be able to angle your stitches a bit more to follow the curve. You really can't go wrong using this method. Notice how the shading gently blends in this one, with no obvious transition between shades. Continue working double rows, changing to the next shade of color each time until it is filled. If the shape starts to straighten out, you can revert back to working 1 row of longer stitches. Notice how smooth the shading looks. It follows the curve accurately with no obvious transition in the changes of color. I'm going to demonstrate on a simple flower with petals that overlap like this. Notice how the overlap of each petal is lighter where it meets the previous one and darker underneath to create a shadow. Without this contrast at the join, we would not be able to see the definition of each petal. You need to start with the petals that are furthest away and work up to the petals in the front. Each petal needs to be defined with a split stitch outline and completed before stitching the next one, so that they look as though they are sitting on top of each other. I'm using 4 shades of golden yellow into rust to stitch the petal. Notice I have stitched some petals in lighter shades and some in deeper shades, so that each petal differs slightly. I have completed some of the petals beforehand. It's a bit like one of those cooking programs. Here's one I did earlier. Start with a split stitch outline using 2 strands of thread. Using the lightest shade of thread and 2 strands in the first row, only stitch random stitches across the shape and then go back and fill them in. Notice that I'm coming down slightly on this side of the shape and leaving a small gap on this side. I want to put in some of the darker shades here so that it creates a shadow underneath this one. Oops, we have a knot. I'm glad this happened because I can show you how to get it out. Pull the loop up until it slips out. Change to one strand of the next shade and fill in the gap in the first row. Now start to blend in the second row. Continue working each row in the next darkest shade as before, until the petal is complete. Turn your work around and look at it from afar. The shades should all blend well into each other, and you should be able to see the shadow here and the light here. You can always go back and add in a bit more shadow on top if you feel there is not enough definition. This is one of the joys of long and short. You can always go back and make corrections on top of your previous stitching. I'm going to show you how to stitch a petal turnover using 2 shades of thread. One of the problems with a turnover is trying to decide which direction the stitches should go. To do this, make a template of the full petal on tracing paper. You will have to add on a bit where the turnover will be. Draw in the direction lines and cut out the template. Fold over the turnover and you can easily see the direction of the lines underneath. Draw these in. I have filled the main petal using 5 shades of mauve from the outside in towards the base. Before you stitch the turnover, underline it with 1 strand of split stitch, using the darkest shade to create a little shadow. Using the lightest shade, outline the turnover in split stitch. Now fill it with satin stitches at the angle of the direction lines. Take the stitches over the edge of the turnover and into the shadow line so that it is just visible. Notice how the turnover appears to sit on top of the petal. This is the same principle as the overlapping flower petals. The turnover is in a lighter shade and there is a shadow underneath. I'm going to demonstrate on this simple leaf using 4 shades of green. A good way to give any leaf dimension is to make sure that the light and dark shades on either side meet at the center vein, like this. I have stitched this side of the leaf beforehand from dark to light, and a split stitch outline in preparation for stitching this side. Using 2 strands of the lightest shade of thread, start at the outside of the leaf and work stitches in towards the center vein. These stitches will be slightly angled in line with your guidelines. Notice that I'm leaving a gap where the shape starts to narrow. I want to bring the next shade in here. Change to 1 strand of the next shade of thread and fill in the gap, then blend it into the next row. Continue stitching each row, blending in the next darkest shade of thread. To deepen the shadow at the center vein, stitch a line of split stitch in the very dark green, and this can be continued up into the stem. I'm going to demonstrate on a wheat grain to show you how to fit shades into a small shape. The shape will be completely or almost filled with the first row of long and short stitch, or depending on the size, you can fill it with satin stitch. Then go back and add the shadows in afterwards on top of the previous stitching. The same principle can be applied to any small shape where you can't fit in rows of long and short stitch. Because the grains of wheat overlap, you should work them as for the flower petals, starting with the one that is furthest back and working forward. Make sure that the lighter area of each grain meets the shadow at the base. I have completed the back grains, and I'm now going to demonstrate on this one in the front. Outline each grain in split stitch using one strand. Work the first row in the lightest shade of thread. Notice that it almost completely fills the shape. Change to the next darkest shade of thread and blend a few stitches into the base of this. Finally, add a few small stitches at the base in the darkest shade to create a deep shadow. You can finish off by adding in a few straight whiskers for each grain. I'm going to demonstrate on a blueberry with 4 shades of blue to show you how to fill a round shape. The same principle can be applied to most round shapes. Notice how I have drawn in very concise guidelines to direct my stitching. The guidelines curve round and meet at the center point of the berry. Start at the outside of the berry and work in towards the center point, following the guidelines at all times. Use the darkest shade of thread and work stitches around the shape in line with your guidelines. Every now and then, the stitches will need to change direction to adjust for the sharp curve. To help the stitches move around this curve, put in a little wedge stitch. This stitch will alter the direction of the other stitches and keep them flowing so that they lie next to each other and don't overlap. Let me show you on a slightly bigger shape so that you can see more clearly. These are the stitches moving around the curve in line with your guidelines. As the stitches move around the curve, you will notice a little V forming here. This is where you want to put in your wedge stitch. I'll stitch the wedge stitches in red so that you can see them more clearly. This wedge stitch is an extra short stitch that sits between the longer stitches. The stitch will occupy a space on the outside of the shape, but will be tucked in between the base of the merged stitches. Let me show you again. Put one in here. Wedge stitches can only be used on the first row. They will alter the direction so that all other rows will naturally follow the curve. Back to our berry. Change to the next shade of thread and work the second row, splitting right back into the first row and staying in line with your guidelines. Continue to work each row with the next shade of thread until the berry is complete. Notice how the darker shades at the top of the berry make the edge seem to recede, whereas the lighter shade at the base creates a highlight which makes the berry look plump and round. To finish off, you can make a few straight stitches at the berry tip in brown. In this part, you will discover how to adapt long and short stitch to create feathers. This stitch is called irregular long and short stitch because it lets go of all the previous rules. The Chinese call it hairy stitch, and you will see why. I'm going to demonstrate on bird feathers, but the same principle can be applied to animal fur or any area where the shading is uneven. If you were working smooth tail feathers like this, the method would be the same as the previous long and short stitch. You would outline each feather section separately and fill them with rows of long and short stitch at an angle towards the growth point. However, when working fluffy feathers, the method is quite different. Instead of working the shades in rows, they are placed wherever you need them. You need to work irregular stitches that blend and encroach into each other, giving the illusion of feathers or fur. I'm going to demonstrate this on a bird's head using 5 shades of aqua and green. The colours are reminiscent of a lilac-breasted roller bird, which is commonly seen in the bush here in southern Africa. Start with the lightest shade and work irregular stitches about 1 centimetre long randomly across the outline of the head. Notice that the stitches are feathered out at the top and come into the point where the feathers grow from the head. It helps to keep in line with the pencil guidelines to establish the direction. These stitches don't need to be as full and close together as before, as I will come back and fill in any gaps with the next shade. I want to create a light fluffy look, so I don't need solid rows. Change to the next shade of thread and continue to add stitches wherever they are needed. Some can go back into the previous row and some can come down into the next row. Keep changing to the next shade and again working randomly across the shape, blending in stitches. It helps to think feathers as you work, light, fluffy feathers. Notice that I'm going against all the rules of the previous long and short stitch. I am placing stitches wherever I want them, sometimes going down into the previous stitches and sometimes coming up. I'm also bleeding between stitches. This is fine, because I'm not trying to create solid rows of smooth shading. I am more concerned with getting the feathers to look light and fluffy, as if they were fluffed up from the bird's head, a bit like my hair looks first thing in the morning. Notice that I'm not working in straight rows. Some of my stitches encroach into the preceding rows and some into the next rows. The shades are placed wherever I need them. You want some of the deeper shades to show behind the lighter shades. Continue filling the shape, changing to the next shade each time until it is completed. See how the highlighted area here gives the illusion of roundness, and the deeper shades recede into the background. On your CD, you will find 7 projects that you can print out and stitch. Each one has step-by-step full-color instructions for you to follow. The projects include everything that we've learnt on the DVD. They are presented in order of difficulty, from beginner to intermediate. This little blue pansy is a good project for beginners. Here is an elegant little rosebud in shades of burgundy. Next, we have 2 charming daisy sprays, one with wheat and rosehips and one with red rosebuds. These will give you the opportunity to try out some of the shapes. This is an Icelandic poppy in vibrant shades of red. Here is a Victorian pansy in soft antique shades. Lastly, a little bluebird with blossoms so that you can try out your feather skills. If you would like to try more projects of different skill levels, you can order online at www.trishburr.co.za.